Good day. Tonight's story is set. How did individuals in the center a long time make weapons without latest instruments? If this type of storytelling helps you loosen up and go to sleep peacefully, suppose free to love the video and subscribe to my channel. Additionally, let me know within the feedback where you are listening from and what time it's there now. If you're competent, turn off the lights and create a relaxed atmosphere for yourself. With the smooth sound of a crackling fire within the history, lets this immersive story, in the lengthy centuries on the whole grouped beneath the general heading of the Center Ages, a span of time customarily loosely defined as starting in the 5th century and extending into the 15th. The making of weapons occupied a place that was once each imperative and, in many respects, unremarkable. Far removed from the urgency and turbulence of battlefields, there existed workshops, outbuildings, forges, sheds, and corners of manorial estates wherein tools, implements, and devices of safety and aggression were long established slowly, cautiously, and based on routines which seldom deviated from lengthy headquartered precedent. For the duration of this time, the work of creating weapons used to be not regarded as a specialized recreation in the modern-day field. The place industrial methods, innovation, and mass construction dominate the landscape. Alternatively, it was folded quietly into the total sample of artisanal life. A blacksmith might make each a plowshare and a sword, and by and large did. A cutler could form a knife intended for a loved one's kitchen, or a dagger meant to hold from a soldier's belt. Such work used to be not glamorous. It was no longer dramatic. It proceeded slowly and without enormous interruption, shaped by way of the demands of weather, availability of substances, social obligations, and ecclesiastical calendars. Weapon making used to be not the area of satisfactory inventors, nor of remoted genius. It was once a practice undertaken by way of average participants with modest expectations, grounded in repetition, guided by communal memory, and restrained via on-hand tools, many of which were themselves made and maintained. With the aid of hand, this section, then, seeks to set up a basis for our working out, no longer of fight or conquest, but of the humdrum methods via which metallic used to be warmed, formed, cooled, and delivered into varieties whose operate was by and large as much ceremonial or symbolic as it was realistic. In view that the methods weapons have been made without the benefit of latest equipment or artificial substances, it is worthwhile to suppose first the final atmosphere. Most likely, these weren't best halls of pastime but simple, low constructions, typically freestanding, repeatedly appended to barns or dwellings. Flooring were earthen. Partitions have been wood or built from uncut stone, held together with lime-founded mortar. Roofs probably thatched or included in wood shingles. Gentle got here from openings within the partitions or by way of translucent animal horn panes. Artificial illumination, when wanted, used to be furnished by tallow candles or oil lamps. The air within such workshops was once quite often stuffed with a low haze of smoke or dust. The scent, even as not ever overpowering, would wear a power blend of ash, oil, iron, and damp earth. There could be the quiet sound of scraping, submitting, and low hammer strikes, which would echo mildly off the picket beams. The percent of labor was unhurried. Tasks adopted the rhythm of the seasons and the pulse of the day. The materials used in the making of weapons had been for essentially the most phase. Nearby, iron ore was once extracted from surface deposits or toilets, the place it fashioned in small nodules. It was then heated in easy bloomery furnaces, nearly pits or low-walled ovens created from clay, stone, and earth, with channels for bellows, to provide air unless the ore grew to become delicate and would be extracted in a spongy mass. This bloom, because it was once known as, contained iron intermixed with slag and different impurities. The system of refining it required gigantic labor. It was overwhelmed, reheated, and folded upon itself. Much of the work was once directed, now not at shaping weapons per se, however, at growing usable iron from its common, unpromising form. Tools available to medieval smiths were simple and few. A hammer, an anvil, a set of tongs, and a file had been among the primary. Bellows, in most cases made out of leather and timber, have been used to develop airflow into a forge, permitting the temperature to rise high sufficient for the iron to turn out to be plausible. For measuring, they're possibly picket templates, or notched sticks. No micrometers, no standard gauges. Precision used to be estimated by means of eye and by using contact, Over time, talent was once developed no longer by means of study, however, with the aid of repetition. In lots of circumstances, the weapons themselves were modest. The easy knife, with a single sharpened side and a picket handle riveted into location, might be used for both utility and safety. Spears, customarily overlooked in fashionable accounts, had been among the most common weapons, requiring handles to formed iron tip and a straight wooden shaft. The tip could be solid from a bar of iron, flattened, tapered, and wrapped round a mandrel to form a socket. The shaft, almost always ash or oak, could be smoothed with a draw knife or scraper. There was once little variant. The notion was to not innovate, but to copy. Guilds and neighborhood customs often played a role in regulating the making of weapons. In higher cities, similar to York, Rouen, or Nuremberg, laws dictated who might produce what number of apprentices probably employed, and what marks have got to be utilized to completed items. But even in smaller villages, casual controls have been gift. These have been shaped via repute, family ties, and availability of work. It was once not normal for an artisan to instantly making swords if he had not been doing so previously. There were expectations, and there have been habits, and these governed the work more absolutely than royal decrees or church mandates. Much of the metalwork finished on this period was bloodless. That's to say, it was once no longer vital to convey the fabric to a molten state. As an alternative, the iron or metal used to be heated until crimson or yellow hot, and then hammered, twisted, or cut. Hardening and tempering had been performed through think, via staring at the color of the metallic, by means of taking note of the sound of a file because it passed across a blade, by using sensing the spring of the metallic within the hand. It was once now not an detailed science. It was once a practiced art, passed down without flourish or ceremony, and discipline to established revision based on influence. Handles had been as a rule constituted of wooden, oak, ash, hornbeam, or elm were most commonly used, depending on what grew locally. The procedure of shaping a handle was simple. A bit of trees used to be selected, cut to length, and carved with a draw knife or small axe. A tangan extension of the blade was inserted into a slot within the timber, and the two had been joined utilizing pins, rivets, or adhesives derived from boiled animal hide. Leather-based wrapping probably brought, or not, decoration, if reward, was once minimal. Most handles were undeniable. The purpose used to be now not aesthetic pleasure, however utility. Over time, and with repeated use, such weapons would wear, edges would stupid, handles would loosen, metal could bend. Repairs have been usual. A damaged factor might be resolid. A loose hilt might be riveted. The work of preserving weapons was once as consistent and unremarkable as the work of constructing them. It used to be a part of the everyday float of labor, undertaken when time allowed, and not often considered noteworthy. There were few sharp strains dividing one craft from an additional. Blacksmith might make nails, hinges, plowshares, arrowheads, and knives within the direction of every week. A cooper might make barrel hoops and also sharpen his own draw knife. A leatherworker could sew scabbards or belts, relying on demand. There was once no expectation of single-reason specialization. Work flowed where need directed it. Coaching was once on the whole familial. A boy would begin aiding within the forge, at the age of 7 or 8, sweeping the ground, pumping the bellows, sorting the scrap. Gradually, he would be permitted to heat iron, then to strike it underneath supervision, and later to shape easy objects. Through his late teens, he would produce complete objects, though most likely under the identifier of his master or father. There had been no diplomas, no certificates. Competence was well known informally, through the quiet nod of approval, the repeat patron, the absence of complaint. And so it used to be that weapons got here into being now, not in thunder, however, in the quiet, methodical, and generally forgotten corners of medieval existence. They had been shaped by using hands stained with soot, guided by means of eyes, expert on dim outlines, and shaped in locations the place the fire burned low, and the air moved slowly, and the sounds of making were soft and constant and repetitive. As this sequence continues, we shall explore more deeply the particulars of these approaches, the substances used, the social and bureaucratic buildings that surrounded creation, and the rhythms of lifestyles that allowed for such work to proceed. However, for now, we remain with the thought that in the long quiet of the middle a while, a weapon was now not a thing of worry or vigor. It was once a factor made, slowly, by way of individuals who lived slowly, and who labored by means of hand, and who knew the metallic not by means of conception, but by using touch. In continuing our slow and uneventful experience by means of the quiet world of medieval weapon construction, it becomes imperative to turn our attention to the topic of materials. Chief among these, in the making of most medieval weapons, was once iron. At the same time, bronze and other alloys have been used in previous intervals, and even though some noble weapons would, on occasion, be inlaid with silver or gilded with decorative intent, it used to be iron that formed the spine of sensible armaments throughout so much of the core a long time. Iron as a substance does not easily present itself in a pure and usable type. It need to be acquired, ready, and cautiously worked before it turns into suitable for even essentially the most basic of weapon-making duties. The first step in this procedure involved the acquisition of iron ore, which was once not undertaken with any fine ceremony or technological sophistication, but as an alternative followed quiet patterns of labor. Headquartered over generations. Most iron in the middle a while used to be sourced in the community. Colossal scale mining used to be infrequent and, when present, most likely rudimentary. More traditionally, iron was obtained from bog irons. Small deposits of iron are observed in wetlands, marshes, and shallow soils, certainly in areas of northern and western Europe. These deposits formed step by step, as iron-wealthy water percolated, by way of natural and organic material, and precipitated iron compounds closed the outside. The influence was once a type of ore which, even though impure and loyalding, would be gathered with slightly simple instruments and minimal infrastructure. Gathering lavatory iron used to be an endeavor, frequently carried out in late summer or early autumn, when water levels were low and the soil extra available. It was once no longer a hurried assignment. One would spend a couple of hours with a shovel or a wooden spade, turning over clumps of earth, watching for the stupid brown or reddish nodules that signaled the presence of usable ore. These would then be collected in baskets or sacks manufactured from coarse cloth or woven willow. Once gathered, the ore could be left to dry, regularly in the open air. In many instances, under lean-tos or easy shelters built from branches and thatch. In some regions, shallow pit mining was once employed. Staff, mostly peasants or tenant workers, supplementing their agricultural responsibilities, would dig into hillsides or slopes where iron-wealthy soil was once recognized to arise. These excavations had been rarely deep and infrequently supported by problematic buildings. Timbering, when it befell, was minimal. The procedure used to be laborious and gradual, involving picks, mattocks, and patient excavation. Earth was lifted out in small quantities and screened by hand. The entire pastime was more tedious than detrimental, more repetitive than dramatic. As soon as eliminated from the earth, the iron ore required training. The purpose was once to slash the presence of extraneous substances, organic matter, clays, silicates, and different non-metal content. In some cases, this used to be finished by washing the ore in picket troughs, making use of ladles or hands to stir and agitate the water. Lighter impurities would flow away, heavier fabric would sink. In different cases, the ore used to be roasted, a process by which it was once heated in open pits or shallow trenches to drive off moisture and a few volatile compounds. Roasting did not smelt the ore. It purely readied it for smelting through, making it extra friable and less complicated to manage. Transportation of or from its supply to the website of smelting was a venture of constant and undramatic hindrance. In areas, the place forges have been placed near the source, comparable to alongside streams or at the edge of woodland clearings. The burden was once lessened, but when distances have been greater, the ore used to be moved via cart, by using PC animal, or in some cases, by human labor alone. Roads have been in general rutted and poorly maintained. PC animals required feed and rest. Carts required wheels to be repaired and axles to be greased with animal fat or beeswax. The journey, therefore, was on the whole gradual and uneventful, punctuated through pauses to relaxation, to fix, or to attend out whether. The choice of forge region used to be mostly decided by using the intersection of three relevant wants: proximity to or access to timber for fuel, and availability of water. Charcoal, no longer coal, was the fundamental gasoline for medieval forges, and it required a tremendous range of bushes to produce. A single bloomery operation could consume a couple of cords of wood for each smelt. As a result, ironworking was almost always placed at the edge of forests, in clearings where felled trees could be converted to charcoal in earthen or clay-included kilns. These kilns were dome-shaped, and the charring approach might take a few days, involving cautious management of airflow and time-honored checking via small side openings. It was now not a fiery spectacle. It used to be a sluggish, smouldering process, supervised with attentiveness but not often pleasure. As soon as charcoal had been produced and/or delivered, the approach of smelting might commence. The bloomery furnace, which was the commonplace smelting apparatus for much of the medieval interval, used to be a simple structure, not often more than 1 to 2 meters in peak, built of clay, stone, or a combination of both. It consisted of a shaft with a gap at the prime for loading, and a scaled-down part with a small aperture by way of which air was once offered through bellows. These bellows, typically operated by way of hand or foot, required a consistent rhythm and colossal patience. Apprentices, or assistants perhaps, assigned the mission of pumping them in shifts, lasting a number of hours. Smelting in a bloomery did not melt the iron. Rather, it caused a chemical reduction in which oxygen used to be eliminated from the iron oxide within the ore, leaving at the back of a mass of iron intermingled with slag. This mass, referred to as a bloom, was once spongy, irregular, and now not yet compatible for shaping. It had to be extracted with tongs or wood poles, and immediately labored at the same time, nonetheless sizzling. The bloom was laid on an anvil, or heavy stone, and struck time and again with hammers to force out the slag and consolidate the iron. This system was once not rapid. It involved reheating, folding, putting, and repeating unless the mass held together with adequate brotherly love. Every bloom yielded most effective a modest amount of usable iron. Much of the fabric was misplaced to slag, waste, or brittle fracture. Throughout working, it was, in essence, a labor-intensive manner of manufacturing a relatively small range of fabric. But the rhythm of this work was predictable. Each stage followed the one earlier than it. There used to be a sluggish unfolding of challenge after mission, hardly ever disrupted by way of novelty or change. Tools used in the coaching of blooms integrated picket paddles, tongs of wrought iron, hammers of more than a few weights, and wedges for splitting the bloom into smaller portions. The work was once collaborative. A grasp smith could direct, while assistants carried out the handbook operations. Conversation was frequently wordless gestures, nods, or acquainted sequences of movement. There used to be no need for guideline as soon as the hobbies had been situated. The procedure had been repeated, frequently unchanged, for generations. At this point, it turns into useful to notice the variation in iron quality. No longer all blooms had been equal. Some contained extra carbon, both from the charcoal or the reduction method itself. These would harden more, simply upon quenching. Others were softer, extra malleable, however less desirable, to aspect retention. As such, choices needed to be made about use. A blade probably forged from a better carbon bloom. A crossguard or pommel would come from a softer piece. There was once no uniform ordinary. Each piece of steel was once judged on its possessed deserves, in most cases through feel, color, or the sound it made under the hammer. Storage of processed iron was casual. Bars or billets might be stacked in a nook, set on picket planks to prevent contact with damp floors. Some have been marked with notches or cuts. Others bore no determining marks in any respect. In better workshops, inventories perhaps stored verbally or by way of chalk markings on boards. There used to be no paper document, no ledger, and little hindrance for systematic documentation. The material used to be few in form and sluggish to accumulate. In abstract, the process of obtaining and getting ready iron within the center a while was once characterized extra by means of endurance than by ingenuity. It was once formed with the aid of the have to repeat as a substitute than the want to innovate. The result was once a material that carried the weight of effort in every bar, a substance that passed slowly from earth to furnace to forge, and that, before ever fitting a weapon, had already been worked, watched, weighed, and winnowed by using patient, uneventful labor. Within the subsequent section, we will proceed further along this path. inspecting how early varieties commenced to take form on the anvil, how rudimentary weapons have been shaped from these billets, and how the shaping process adhered more to memory and muscle than to dimension and design. However, for now, we go away our iron stacked and cooling, its surfaces faintly tough, its edges stupid, its intent not but fulfilled, resting in the quiet shadows of a medieval smithy. Following the quiet and chronic practice of usable iron, the medieval smith or artisan would, within the course of his work, start the subsequent phase of weapon making, particularly the shaping of the iron into a preliminary form. This stage, unlike the more abstract phases of mining or smelting, involved the more seen transformation of raw material into objects that might, with time, resemble instruments or weapons. Nonetheless, it was now not a swift system. The rhythm remained slow, the labor steady, the effects incremental. There was little that perhaps described as unique or novel. The shaping of iron began with heating. A billet of iron formed throughout prior levels by way of folding, hanging, and refining the bloom used to be positioned into the forge. The forge itself was once a simple fireside lined with stone or clay. Charcoal used to be the principal fuel. Bellows have been used to introduce air and lift the temperature. The iron was positioned cautiously into the most up-to-date part of the fire, recognized with the aid of feel and dependency as an alternative than thermometric precision. After some time, which varied with the thickness of the billet and the nature of the charcoal, the iron would begin to glow. The preferred warmness was frequently a bright red or orange, indicating that the steel was sufficiently gentle to be shaped beneath the hammer. The smith used tongs to remove the heated billet and positioned it on the anvil. The anvil, a heavy and immobile piece of iron or metal, was the primary point of the workshop. Its surface used to be worn tender by means of years of use. It did not gleam. It was now not decorative. It used to be a useful, passive device, receiving countless influences without commentary. The hammer, like the anvil, used to be utilitarian. It came in various sizes. A small hammer for detail work, a medium hammer for general shaping, a heavier hammer for drawing out the metal. The choice of hammer was made instinctively. Most smiths preferred instruments of their possess-making, or these passed down by way of a predecessor. Handles had been worn to the shape of the consumer's grip. The work, as soon as begun, followed a familiar sequence. The billet was once flattened by means of repeated hammer strikes. The smith held the metal in position with tongs and used the hammer to skinny it evenly, turning it over, adjusting the angle, checking its straightness by eye on my own. When the metal cooled, it used to be back to the hearth. Heating and potting alternated in predictable intervals. There was little dialogue in the course of this method. Those who assisted did so without prompting. The work was once no longer noisy. It was once rhythmic. To type a knife. For illustration, the smith began via tapering one end of the billet right into a factor. This point used to be then multiplied to kind the blade. The other end perhaps left as a Thames or curled moderately for attachment to a handle. There was no mold, no common form. Blades assorted depending on cause. A common intent knife, probably, quick and vast. A carving blade, longer and thinner. These choices have been made regularly. The shape emerged via repetition, no longer by way of sudden alternate. A spearhead followed an identical procedure. The billet used to be flattened and widened, after which the edges were drawn out and shaped into a symmetrical leaf or triangular kind. The bottom of the spearhead used to be all set to receive a shaft. Commonly this worried curling the metallic around a mandrel to create a socket. Different times a tang was once shaped, which would be inserted into a picket pole and secured with pins or lashings. The tools used for this shaping have been minimal. A mandrel used to be usually just a round bar of iron fixed to a wooden block. The shaping itself required nothing more than suffer a hammering, conventional reheating, and quiet attention to element. Blades intended for bigger weapons, comparable to swords or lengthy daggers, weren't created in a single session. The billets have been drawn out slowly over a couple of cycles of heating and hanging. This process, referred to as drawing out, involved lengthening the metal by means of hammering it in a controlled path. The smith ensured that the thickness remained steady, that the blade didn't curve unintentionally, that the sides did not crack. Any error had to be corrected early. In any other case, the entire billet might need to be reforged or discarded. The sharpening of edges was now not carried out at this stage. Early shaping focused most effective on type. Edges remained thick, facets were rounded. These can be refined in later phases. For now, the major intention was symmetry and straightness. These had been judged without instruments. A blade was held up to the light. Its define used to be traced with the eyes. It was once set on a flat floor to examine for warp. Imperfections had been famous, then slowly corrected with the aid of reheating and extra hammering. The repetitive nature of this work stimulated a meditative state. Time passed without notice. Hours turned slowly. The heat of the forge rose and fell. The clink of metal on steel echoed evenly across the workshop. There used to be no urgency. The rhythm of shaping was no longer rushed. The form of the blade emerged regularly, without fanfare. It is worth noting that the iron used for the period of this stage varied in its interior consistency. Some billets contained extra slag, others were extra brittle. When such flaws were detected, the smith did not discard the metallic until without doubt essential. Instead, it was once remodeled, reforged, or repurposed for a different tool. An improper billet might come to be a chisel. A brief length of iron probably turned into a hook or hinge. Waste was minimized. Each fragment had capabilities. Use, shaping, didn't occur in isolation. Alongside the blade, other components of the weapon started out to take form. A crossguard for a sword, in general a easy bar of iron, was prepared up front. A pommel, commonly little greater than a rounded or squared weight, used to be cast and filed individually. These can be assembled later. For now, they rested in baskets, or on benches, waiting their flip. Handles had been likewise begun for the period of this stage. Wood used to be selected for its grain, its straightness, its dryness. It used to be cut to length and tough-shaped with knives or axes. Holes have been drilled utilizing bow drills or gimlets. No adhesives have been but utilized. These portions, too, have been saved nearby, quietly collecting in anticipation of assembly. As days handed, the workshop stuffed with the slow progression of one-half completed items. There have been blades with unfinished tangs, spears with rough sockets, daggers without guards. Each object marked a factor along a path of transformation, neither raw nor complete. This intermediate stage was the most long established. Few items moved swiftly from billet to blade. Most lingered in partial form. The environment itself contributed to the unhurried PC. Gentle faded early in iciness. Gas was finite. The forge probably allowed to cool if no urgent mission remained. Rain made the workshop damp. Snow slowed the advent of supplies. These reasons weren't noticeable as limitations, simply realities. The smith tailored, adjusting his timetable to the rhythms of the traditional world. Sometimes, a patron would discuss with a neighborhood lord or steward, a farmer, a tradesman. They'd describe a need, mainly on the whole terms. A substitute, knife, a new spear, a set of arrowheads. The smith might offer a nod, a few questions, an indistinct estimation of time. There were no receipts, no contracts. The agreement was once remembered, the work delivered to a intellectual list, to be begun when other objects allowed. And so the weapons of the core a long time commenced to take shape. Now not in a rush of sparks or noise, however in quiet, repetitive labor. Iron passed from the fireplace to the anvil, and again, shapes emerged slowly. Edges remained stupid. Points stayed blunt. The work endured as it normally had, without haste, without spectacle, without deviation. Within the following section, we will evaluate how these preliminary varieties have been sophisticated, how sharpening, hardening, and tempering had been performed, now not with precision instruments, however by means of slow remark, repeated follow, and the steady software of heat and water. However, for now, we remain in the forge, where unfinished blades leisure quietly, ready for the following round of shaping, and the fireplace glows low, warming the stones, humming softly, in no hurry at all. Once the basic shape of a blade had been drawn out and formed at the anvil, the medieval craftsman would flip to the quieter, subtler phases of refinement. These levels weren't dramatic. They did not contain unexpected trade. Rather, they consisted of sluggish and repetitive systems, implemented with modest tools and an even more modest sense of ceremony. In these phases, sharpening, hardening, and tempering the blade would come to be more than only a form. It will start, regularly, to resemble a usable instrument. Sharpening, within the medieval context, was not a single event. It was once an approach that unfolded in levels, each and every one getting ready the surface of the blade for the next. Preliminary shaping had left the brink thick and blunt. There was no quality taper, no actual sharpness. The smith would now begin to remove material from the brink, making use of abrasion. Step 1 in this process concerned using coarse grinding stones. These stones quarried from local deposits and most commonly formed via hand, assorted in dimension and composition. Some had been fixed in function. Others had been small, ample to be held and moved over the blade. Higher wheels had been sometimes circled by way of hand or foot, but this was no longer long established in small workshops. By and large, the smith comfortably rubbed the blade along the stone's floor, maintaining a regular angle. There was no measuring device to assess this attitude. It used to be estimated by eye, proven by means of touch. The sound of steel against stone used to be tender, however chronic, a scraping, repetitive sound, broken only by using the need to shift roll, to check up on the growth, or to re-wet the stone. Water or oil was once applied to the outside of the stone, to carry away filings and minimize warmness. This, too, was carried out by means of believe. A small container sat nearby, refilled as needed. There used to be no rush. Progress was once slow. The threshold became gradually thinner. This first grinding stage removed nearly all of the material. It was adopted through finer levels, each using a smoother stone. The scratches from the coarser grit had been changed by using smaller ones. Finally, the brink would believe delicate to the contact, though nonetheless dull compared to ultra-modern expectations. Medieval blades were not made razor-sharp within the workshop. They have been sharpened according to operate, and quite often additional honed within the discipline. Within the keep, the purpose used to be now not brilliance, but stability. Following sharpening, a extra delicate operation would start hardening. This process required careful control of temperature, though no thermometers were present. That blade was once positioned into the forge once more, this time not to form, but to arrange for a change in constitution. Because the steel absorbed warmness, its color shifted. Skilled smiths watched the hue intently relocating from darkish pink to cherry red, and eventually to orange. The color indicated the inner temperature. It was located under dim lighting. To be certain accuracy, bright daylight would obscure these refined changes. As soon as the favored color was carried out, the blade used to be eliminated from the fireplace. Directly, it was once plunged right into a vessel of water, or, much less traditionally, oil. The liquid hissed and bubbled. Steam rose gently. The blade was held nonetheless. Movement might rationale warping. The surprising cooling prompted the constitution of the metal to change. Carbon atoms, now extra lively, aligned in a different way. The blade grew to become more difficult, although also extra brittle. This brittleness required correction. It used to be addressed via tempering. This, too, used to be a method defined through slowness and statement. The hardened blade used to be cleaned calmly with a file or material to reveal its flaw. Then it used to be slowly reheated, both by way of inserting it close the threshold of the forge, or by means of passing it carefully over a flame. The intention was not to return the blade to forging temperature. Rather, it used to be warmed, until faint color bands appeared yellow, then straw, then brown, and subsequently blue. Each color signaled a distinctive temperature variety. Most blades were tempered on the straw color. This softened the steel somewhat, reducing brittleness, even as retaining much of its hardness. The blade was then cooled slowly. Commonly it used to be laid on a stone surface, far away from wind and moisture. It was once now not plunged into water once more. This gradual cooling preserved the inner structure and allowed the blade to relax. If carried out adequately, the blade would now be both hard, enough to hold an aspect, and tender ample to resist breaking. Not all blades had been treated identically. The composition of the iron, the meant use, and the preferences of the user all influenced the approach. A dagger probably hardened more than a cleaver. A spearhead might obtain only minimal tempering. These selections weren't standardized. They had been made case by means of case, established on experience, availability, and dependency. After tempering, the blade used to be inspected. It used to be held at an attitude to the light. Its part used to be checked by using going for walks, a thumbnail alongside it, listening for inconsistency. The flat of the blade was tapped gently with a fingernail or software. A stupid ring would point out a flaw. A clearer tone recommended integrity. These weren't unique assessments. They were indicators, used to advise of further refinement. Extra sharpening might be implemented at this stage. A finer stone, or even a strip of leather based with abrasive powder, possibly used to shine the brink. However, most blades have been left simplest reasonably sharpened. Over-sharpening would shorten the blade's existence. As a substitute, the person was once expected to preserve the threshold by means of periodic honing, making use of stones, or rods applicable to the assignment. Handles and fittings were not but brought. The blade remained a clean blade, lacked ornament, lacked grip, lacked stability. It was once a usable kind, but no longer but a finished device. It rested again, together with other blades in equivalent situation. Some had been completely tempered, others were ready for the forge to heat. Nonetheless, others had been rejected and can be It advanced when time and gas allowed. There used to be no formal documentation of this method. No logs, no charts, no formulation. Knowledge was held in reminiscence. Selections have been made through touch, by way of sight, via intuition built from repetition. An apprentice would spend years observing before being allowed to move a blade. Even then, the primary makes and attempt were supervised. Errors had been anticipated. Correction used to be quiet and unremarkable. Instruments used during this segment included whetstones of various grit, water basins, files, and clamps. Some smiths used rudimentary vices to preserve blades constant. Others relied on an assistant's fingers. There was little variant in process from one retailer to one more. Alterations happened slowly, over a long time, generally based on small improvements or fabric availability. Disasters were not distinctive. A blade might crack for the duration of hardening. It could warp for the duration of cooling. Such portions were back to the forge and remodeled. The iron was not wasted. It was simply lower back to the previous stage. The method started out once more. There was no feel of urgency or disappointment. The fabric didn't cooperate or rebel. It without problems responded in line with its nature. And so the blade passed by way of fireplace, water, and stone. It was once formed, sharpened, hardened, and tempered, now not with machines or gauges, but with quiet statement and unhurried labor. Each segment unfolded slowly, without haste. The outcomes used to be now not perfection, but performance. The blade was prepared to be used, no longer for display, now not for glory, readily to be used. Within the next part, we will transfer gently into the world of meeting. Don't forget how handles have been formed and attached, how guards and pommels have been outfitted, and how blades became instruments competent of being held, carried, and used. But for now, the blades relaxation quietly, aligned in rows or gathered in baskets, their surfaces stupid, their edges resting, their transformation carrying on with slowly, as consistently, in the silence of the medieval workshop. With the blade now hardened and tempered, cooled and inspected, the following segment in the weapon's production was certainly one of measured blend. This phase didn't contain hearth or heavy putting, but rather targeted attention and smooth. Becoming the blade was once to be joined with its manage. A preserve, where wanted, would be positioned between the two. A pommel, possibly introduced, now not for ornament, but for counterbalance. These accessories weren't industrially produced. They have been all set in small batches or formed for my part, most regularly by means of the equal hands that had fashioned the blade. The transition from separate materials to complete software was uneventful, deliberate, and slow. The handle, usually known as the grip, was regularly product of timber. The decision of wood used to be centered on availability, workability, and sturdiness. Oak, ash, hornbeam, elm, or boxwood had been used. They weren't exotic. They were not infrequent. They were chosen for the reason that they could be shaped. And considering the fact that they held up under use, the grain of the timber mattered. Straight grain was favored. Warped or knotted portions had been discarded or repurposed. Seasoning was major. Green wooden could reduce or cut up. Timber was once stored indoors, off the bottom, for months or years. There used to be no schedule. It used to be used when equipped. The blank for the control was reduced to approximate measurement. If the tang of the blade was straight and slim, a matching slot could be carved or drilled. The blade's tang was inserted into this opening. Some tangs were tapered. others squared. Some handed through the entire handle, others stopped part-way. The procedure different, however, the reason remained the equal: to create a secure, stable joint. To shape the manage, tools had been minimal. A draw knife probably used for rough shaping, a scraper for smoothing. Sanding used to be performed with dried rushes, rough material, or stones. The control was formed to the form of the user's hand, however, no longer exactly. There were no molds. There were no unique measurements. Experience guided the form. Every handle was once relatively exceptional. Every grip moderately different. Over time, the wooden would polish by means of use. The skin would darken with oil from the hand. These alterations had been expected, no longer averted. If the blade required a protector crosspiece to safeguard the hand it was once geared up before the manage, the look-after used to be, by and large, a easy bar of iron, cast flat and slit, to permit the temps to go through. The slot used to be filed cautiously, widened as needed, checked for match many times. The blade used to be inserted from above. The look-after used to be tapped down gently. In some circumstances, the joint was once hammered lightly to create a friction match. In others, smooth steel comparable to pewter or lead was melted into the void to ease the joint. Adhesives had been hardly ever used. Clamping and compression had been more common. The pommel, if present, used to be final. This might be a circular or squared piece of iron or bronze. Its primary function was to balance the weight of the blade. It also helped cozy the control with the aid of peening that's, with the aid of knocking down the top of the temps over the pommel to type a rivet. This used to be done with a small hammer. The metal used to be struck, except it expanded and held the pommel tight in opposition to the wood. In some instances, threads have been reduced into the temps, and the pommel was screwed into place. This was once more infrequent, and required further tools. Most smiths favored easier methods. No part of this meeting procedure used to be rushed. Fitting took time. Small changes were usual. A handle might be reshaped moderately to enhance steadiness. A preserve may be replaced if the slot was once misaligned. The smith labored without timetable. If a purchaser inquired, they possibly instructed, soon, or earlier than the month's finish. Such estimations weren't binding. The work could be accomplished when it used to be capable. As soon as assembled, the weapon was inspected. Again, the alignment was once checked. The blade must take a seat straight within the handle. The defend must be even. The pommel will have to leisure flush. The smith didn't use stages or squares. The eye, knowledgeable by means of repetition, was once the predominant instrument. The hand, feeling for looseness or imbalance, used to be the second dot. If leather-based wrapping was favored on the handle, it was utilized after assembly. A strip of leather, soaked in water, used to be wound across the grip and secured at the ends. As it dried, it shrank, tightening in opposition to the timber. In some instances, wire or twine used to be used underneath the leather-based to add thickness. In other circumstances, the grip used to be left bare. Private choice and material availability dictated the alternative. Decorative touches, if utilized, had been easy. A stamped sample, a line scored with a knife, an inlay of bone or horn. These were rare and rarely difficult. Completed weapons have been stored on cabinets, in racks, or with no trouble laid on cloth-protected benches. They weren't oiled unless needed. They weren't polished for look. They had been supposed to be used, no longer for show. Their worth was useful. Their beauty lay in stability and reliability. A good-made weapon required no embellishment. It effortlessly did its work. Once in a while, a mark was delivered to the blade, a simple image, an initial, a gadget passed down by means of generations. This was once, now not branding. It was once awareness. If a weapon failed, the mark might be remembered. If it held up, so to the popularity of the maker. These marks were punched, no longer etched. They were small and discreet. Their meaning was identified handist to a few. There were no ceremonies for completed blades, no declarations, no dramatic displays. The completed weapon used to be handed over, most likely with little comment. Cost, when required, perhaps in coin, or goods, or carrier, a sack of grain, a repaired yoke, a future prefer. Records weren't stored. Memories served. Within the occasion that a blade needed restore, it might be again. Unfastened guards were refit. Cracked handles were changed. Bent blades have been reheated and straightened. A weapon was once no longer discarded until ruined. Preservation multiplied its life. Few craftsmen made weapons handist. The same palms that soldered a sword additionally formed hinges, reduced nails, or repaired plowshares. Weapon making was once a part of a broader apply. It was now not exalted. It was once now not separate. It was once with no trouble, an extra project, among many. And so the assembly procedure concluded no longer with applause, however with quiet completion. A blade grew to be a weapon. A shape grew to become a software. Its creation marked now not by way of unexpected transformation, however by steady effort, sluggish becoming, an ultimate stillness. By within the next section, we can turn to the sector, past the forge, exploring the mundane logistics of distribution and delivery, how weapons have been saved, ordered, transported, and quietly exchanged in the course of medieval lifestyles. However, for now, the assembled instruments relaxation, in the shop, lined up towards the wall, ready for use, or now not used, as time, war, or labor might require. Once a weapon was once assembled and put aside, its constituents equipped. Its surface cooled, its function founded. It didn't instantly spring into motion. Rather, it probably remained still for a while. Days could move, weeks even. Finished weapons, like tools or implements of daily use, had to be saved, managed, and ultimately transported to their locations. This section of weapon making was once rarely described in chronicles or deaths. It was once now not considered brilliant. It used to be now not marked with the aid of ceremony or flair. As a substitute, it unfolded gently, as a part of the ongoing movement of goods throughout small distances, in a global that moved more slowly than it used to be, more commonly remembered. The storage of weapons, even these of average first rate, used to be no longer a matter of vaults or guarded arsenals. Most often, in smaller workshops and nearby forges, weapons have been saved in undeniable sight. Completed blades rested against walls. Spears leaned in bundles near doorways. Daggers and knives were placed in wooden bins or hung from beams using easy leather-based loops. Iron was once heavy, however manageable. Shelves bore the weight comfortably. No complex techniques of cataloging had been employed. A craftsman remembered what he had made. His apprentices knew where each object lay. If one used to be offered, it was taken down. If one was once commissioned, it was once marked through placement. Dirt amassed, surfaces dulled. Leather grips grew dry if left untreated. Every now and then, someone passed a cloth over a blade. On occasion, anyone didn't. The state of readiness various. There was once no urgency. Weapons were not kept honed except needed. Sharpening was done earlier. Then use a blade with leisure, unpolished, for years. Orders, when placed, had been neither numerous nor formal. In cities, guild structures frequently required a report. A scribe might file a purchase order on parchment. Extra often, agreements had been verbal. A knight, a steward, a reeve, or a merchant would request a sword, or a dozen spearheads, or a number of knives. The blacksmith nodded. The object could be made. Delivery was anticipated at a later date, agreed upon with little specificity. The expectation was once that it could be equipped when it was equipped. In rural areas, orders have been much more casual. A farmer might request an alternative blade in trade for a sack of barley. A traveler would inquire a few dagger for the street. These exchanges came about without contracts. The smith committed the need to memory. When time authorized, the work was once accomplished. If no longer, the patron waited, or returned, or discovered a different, bigger orders did arise, mainly when cities prepared for unrest or lords outfitted retainers. In such cases, a number of smiths probably concerned. Duties were divided. One made blades, a different geared up handles, a third sharpened. There was no principal management. The work flowed as it would. A steward might check up on the results. Fee might comply with in levels. Even in such circumstances, urgency was infrequent. Until war was impending, the work was once unhurried. As soon as an item was once ready for delivery, transportation had to be arranged. Ordinarily, the purchaser got here to acquire the item. It was once wrapped in material or tied with leather and carried away. If the object was to be delivered, the smith or an assistant could do so strolling. For longer distances, a cart possibly, shared with different items. Swords traveled alongside sacks of grain. bolts of cloth, and pots of honey. There were no special cubicles, no velvet linings. The weapons have been tied down with rope or laid between objects. The intention used to be to avert transferring, not to keep appearance. Damage throughout transport used to be infrequent, however not unknown. A tip could bend, a handle would loosen. Upon arrival, the recipient inspected the goods. If a correction used to be needed, it was made quietly. A loose shield was once tapped back into situation. A nicked facet used to be smoothed. There were few complaints. Expectations were modest. In some instances, weapons handed from one hand to an extra couple of instances earlier than reaching their ultimate proprietor. A village smith offered a knife to a dealer. The trader bought it to a service provider. The service provider passed it to a soldier. At each step, the object won or misplaced price, depending on its condition and need. No records tracked these movements. The item itself bore the indicators of its journey's cuffs. On the control, discoloration on the blade, traces of older repairs. These weren't considered flaws. They were quite simply the fact of use. When weapons had been ordered in, variety, storage before transport grew to become more structured. Spearheads were bundled and tied with rope. Blades had been stacked between layers of cloth or straw. Crates, when used, have been basic. Planks nailed together, without markings. Porters lifted them onto carts or sleds. Roads were traditionally uneven. Journey was once sluggish. Deliveries might take days or even weeks, depending on weather and terrain. Delivery was now not at all times the accountability of the maker. In many instances, it was once assumed that the customer would retrieve the goods. A messenger possibly sent forward, a date agreed. The smith would have the items competent. If no longer collected, they remained in the shop. No penalties were imposed. Time moved in a different way. Delays had been customary. In cities with centered markets, weapons were sometimes supplied for common sale. These had been displayed on wood tables or putting racks. The buyer inspected the items, weighed them within the hand, requested questions. Transactions were temporary. Cost was once made. The object was once wrapped or slung at the belt. There used to be little discussion of best. Rate mirrored expectation. Returns had been rare. If a weapon broke, it used to be repaired. If it failed completely, it was once frequently understood as misfortune. Blame was once now not perpetually assigned. Life itself was once field to failure. Tools have been no exceptional among the aristocracy. Exchanges have been rather extra formal. A steward positioned the order. The weapons have been anticipated by means of an exact date. The smith probably summoned for inspection. Fee, frequently, in coin, might be delayed until supply. Even then, no receipts have been exchanged. A nod, a phrase, an oath. These sufficed. Weapons no longer collected might be saved indefinitely. A blade made for one man could eventually be bought to an additional. A spear all set for a levy that under no circumstances materialized could remain in the retailer unless rust recommended repurposing. Nothing moved speedily. Nothing was once wasted. Metallic could continuously be reforged. Wooden would invariably be reshaped. Within the broader rhythm of medieval life, the distribution of weapons was certainly one of many such flows. Grain moved from discipline to mill. Material from loom to stall. Pots from kiln to kitchen. Weapons traveled in a similar fashion. Without prestige, without drama, they were tools. They were needed. They had been made. They had been moved. And so this section, too, passed quietly. The blades, once solid, have been wrapped and carried. The spears, as soon as socketed, have been leaned into carts. The daggers, once sharpened, have been slid into belts. The makers back to their retail outlets. The customers back to their farms. The movement of goods endured, gradual and unremarkable. Within the subsequent part, we shall compare the assisting professions, those whose quiet contributions made weapon-making viable. The charcoal burners, the woodcutters, and others. However, for now, the blades are on the road. The carts are rolling slowly, and the forge rests quiet once more, until the next order arrives. The making of weapons in the middle a long time, though probably attributed to the blacksmith or the armorer, didn't occur in isolation. It rested upon a much broader basis, a community of quiet people whose work, though hardly ever chronicled, was once, however, predominant. These weren't warriors. They did not wield the weapons. They did not even form the blades. But without them, the procedures described in prior sections might not have befell. They were providers of material and performance. Their work unfolded, slowly, most likely in rural settings, generally unchanged across generations. Among the many essential of these aiding figures had been the charcoal burners. Without charcoal, the forge would no longer be kindled. Iron could no longer be heated. Blades could no longer be formed. Yet charcoal used to be now not mined. It was once now not observed. It was made by means of a gradual, controlled system, requiring patience and events. The charcoal burner worked in forests, far from towns. There, bushes had been felled now not indiscriminately. However, in line with expertise handed down orally, hardwoods were preferred. Oak, beech, hornbeam. The logs have been reduced to size, generally with axes and saws that required generic sharpening. The instruments were easy. The labor was consistent. As soon as accumulated, the logs had been stacked in mounds, organized vertically and blanketed with layers of earth, turf, and sod. A small opening allowed for ignition. A further allowed smoke to escape. The pile was once set alight, then allowed to smolder slowly over several days. The system was no longer considered one of burning, but of managed carbonization. If air entered too quickly, the wood would combust. If insufficient air was once reward, the transformation would halt. The charcoal burner watched the smoke. Its color and speed printed the state of the system. Adjustments have been made quietly, by using overlaying or uncovering small vents. There were no thermometers, no devices. Handiest experience when the burn was once entire. The mound used to be opened. The charcoal, now gentle and brittle, was once collected by hand. It used to be stored in sacks or baskets, then transported, via cart, to regional forges. Fee might be in coin. Extra, most commonly. It used to be through trade. The burner, when now not producing charcoal, could mend fences, or alternate for salted meat, or barter for coarse fabric. There used to be no glamour within the challenge. Charcoal dust clung to every floor. Clothing was once blackened. Hands have been cracked. However, the burner again, season after season, because the work was once needed. Woodcutters, although usually the identical contributors, additionally played a position. They cleared bushes, cut planks, cut up billets. Their instruments had been few. A felling axe, a noticed, a wedge and mallet. Timber were felled in iciness, when sap was low. Logs were slowly. These meant for spear shafts or handles were stored upright, under duvet, away from rain. The woodcutter knew which trees bent, which break up, which held fasteners. This potential used to be no longer written. It used to be found. The flawed wooden would warp. The proper wood would maintain. Leatherworkers contributed in smaller, however, nonetheless vital methods. A scabbard, though no longer a part of the weapon itself, protected the blade. A belt allowed it to be carried. A wrapped grip expanded handling. Leather-based got here from hides, which got here from tanners, who worked near streams. The tanning procedure was long, malodorous, and repetitive. Skins had been soaked in lime, scraped, rinsed, soaked once more in tannin-rich beverages comprised of bark or gallnuts. The effect was bendy, long-lasting leather suitable for strapping, sheathing, wrapping. The leather worker cut strips, pierced holes, threaded cords. A punch made holes. A bone folder creased traces. Stitching used to be performed with waxed thread and curved needles. The work used to be quiet. The odor of leather lingered. The instruments made delicate sounds. Days handed with little variation. Toolmakers, too, supported the smith. Although many smiths made their possessed tongs and hammers, some instruments have been bought from others. Records, chisels, mandrels and clamps required shaping and hardening. A toolmaker's forge resembled the smith's. However, the objects produced have been smaller, extra unique. These tools were bought hardly ever. They were bartered or handed down. When a software broke, it was repaired. When it wore, it was There used to be little novelty. Designs remained unchanged. Rope makers sometimes supplied goods as good. Short lengths of wire had been used to bind weapons throughout transport, to lash spearheads, to shafts, or to fasten grips. Rope was once constructed from flax or hemp, soaked, beaten, combed, and twisted. The rope maker walked backward along a frame, slowly twisting fibers into strands, and strands into cords. A crank could help. Extra as a rule, It was once performed by hand. The completed product was once coiled, tied, and hung for drying. It resisted water. It held knots. It used to be, in essence, traditional. But it surely used to be fundamental. Ironmongers, many times cellular, in many instances settled, also performed a role. They gathered scrap. They redistributed steel. In areas without local ore, they had been critical. They brought bars from other regions. They traded bloom for tools. Their carts had been sluggish, their inventories uneven. They arrived without timetable. Once they came, they had been welcomed. When they left, they had been forgotten, except needed again. In cities, porters moved finished goods from workshop to stall. They carried bundles, crates, sacks. Their expertise was once geographic, not technical. They knew where a buyer lived. They knew when roads were dry. They knew which hotels allowed carts. Their contribution was once motion, now not making. Nonetheless, it mattered. Better halves, daughters, and young apprentices performed supporting duties. They swept the forge. They fetched water. They became the grindstone. They all set ingredients. They repaired apparel. These movements weren't listed in charters. They did not show up in guild registers. However, without them, the forge would no longer operate. Their labor was once quiet and continuous. All of these roles, charcoal burner, woodcutter, tanner, porter, apprentice, shaped the foundation under the noticeable work of weapon making. None held status. None have been infrequent. Every was shaped through movements. Every relied on simple instruments and regular repetition. Their work converted little over the centuries. Their methods were passed on not via books, however by way of demonstration. A baby watched, then assisted, then did, then taught. The cycle was unbroken. There were no monuments to these trades, no epics, no tales, but their contribution was real. Without charcoal, there was once no fireplace. Without wooden, no handle. Without leather-based, no grip. Without rope, no fastening. Without water, no quenching. The weapon rested on layers of quiet work, each one most important, each and every one forgotten via name but no longer by way of operate. In the subsequent part, we will compare the role of regulation and oversight, how guilds, councils, and common regulation formed the craft of weapon making in refined, customarily ignored methods. But for now, the assisting trades raise on. The burner watches the smoke. The cutter splits the log. The tanner stirs the vat. The work continues, because it at all times has, below the clang of hammers and the quiet shaping of iron. At the same time, the making of weapons within the center a while usually took location in remoted forges and village workshops. It was once now not totally ungoverned. Over time, and particularly in towns and cities, constructions emerged to keep an eye on creation, manipulate quality, and hold founded ways. These constructions didn't function rapidly or impose strict uniformity. As a substitute, they functioned slowly, carefully, and generally quietly. Oversight was once a topic of way of life as much as authority. Ideas have been adopted no longer from fear, however from habit. Compliance was anticipated, although not often enforced with force. Much of it passed off within the historical past, unobserved, unchanged, and unstated. Some of the main types of oversight used to be the guild. These organizations, more customary in urban centers than in rural areas, brought together craftsmen of the identical exchange. There have been guilds for blacksmiths, for cutlers, for armorers, and for related professions. Every guild operated according to its possessed set of rules, a lot of which had been founded many years and even centuries previous. These principles had been preserved in charters or recorded orally, and handed from one new release to the next. The cause of a guild used to be no longer best to look after the pursuits of its contributors, but additionally to maintain requirements. These requirements worried the weight and stability of blades, the sturdiness of spearheads, the becoming of hilts, the pricing of goods, and the quantity of apprentices allowed per grasp. Laws weren't tricky. Most had been common in nature. A blade ought to now not bend readily. A pummel must now not come unfastened. A consumer ought to no longer be cheated. Enforcement was minimal. Violations, when observed, have been addressed with quiet conversations or small fines. Formal trials were infrequent. Guilds desired decision by consensus, not war of words. Membership in a guild was once no longer automatic. One began as an apprentice, serving beneath a grasp for a number of years. This interval different, usually 5 to 7 years, throughout which the apprentice was fed, housed, and suggested he didn't obtain wages. Though small tokens perhaps given, he swept, watched, became bellows, and discovered. Finally, he grew to be a journeyman. He might now produce gadgets below his possessed title. However, he remained beneath the guidance of the guild. Only after producing a masterpiece, an object judged appropriate via senior participants, could he come to be a master himself. This approach was gradual. Most journeymen remained so for existence. Guild meetings were held at typical intervals. These gatherings were not tremendous. Attendance was once anticipated, but now not constantly enforced. The atmosphere was once more, often than not, a rented hall or a quiet room in a tavern. Issues incorporated pricing, apprentice behavior, material shortages, or disputes with different guilds. Votes have been taken, files had been saved, in brief notes. If, in any respect, there were no difficult rituals, the tone was administrative. Guild marks had been usually required. These have been small symbols punched into the blade or stamped onto the control. They indicated the maker and, via extension, the guild that oversaw him. Patrons came to appreciate these marks. A blade with no mark may be wondered. In some cities, it might now not be offered overtly. In others, it was without problems viewed suspect. The mark was once now not ornamental. It used to be a form of quiet accountability. External of guilds, oversight took the type of municipal rules. Town councils, particularly in locations like Paris, Nuremberg, or London, issued ordinances related to the sale and manufacture of weapons. These most likely addressed concerns of public protection or market equity. For instance, not more than a precise number of daggers might be sold in a single market stall, or blades longer than a specified measure required specified permission. Such rules had been posted in public places, written in Latin or the vernacular, on boards or parchments. Most were ignored unless anyone complained. Inspections did arise. An official, most commonly referred to as a clerk or bailiff, would seek advice from workshops. He would appear at blades, experiment sharpness, assess weights. These visits were transient. A nod was given. Just a few phrases exchanged. Only gross violations acquired punishment. A poorly made weapon perhaps confiscated. A repeat wrongdoer may be fined. Most smiths on no account experienced such penalties. Their work was perfect, and their repute preserved them. Long-established law also played a position. In villages, rules were not often written. They were identified by way of repetition. A smith who sold a weak blade misplaced patrons. A smith who undercut others used to be spoken to. The group regulated itself via reminiscence and expectation. Deviations have been discouraged now not by means of courts, but by means of silence, disapproval, or lack of industry. Religious oversight was minimal, but reward. Detailed holy days prohibited work. Forges were quiet on feast days. In the course of Lent, work slowed. On Sundays, it ceased. Smiths found these customs not from compulsion. However, considering the fact that everybody did, failure to take action drew concentration. That was ample. Fabric sourcing was normally constrained. In cities, iron might handist be bought from accepted merchants. Charcoal possibly rationed for the duration of shortages. Guilds intervened to be certain equity. Prices had been negotiated. Deliver was once shared. Disputes, when they came about, have been settled by way of compromise. Violence was infrequent. Apprenticeship contracts, when written, had been simple. A name, a date, a promise to serve and to teach. These had been signed with marks or witnessed by way of neighbors. Breach of contract was exotic. Expectations were clear. The apprentice realized. The grasp prompt. Both fulfilled their position. Taxation affected creation not directly. Some cities imposed responsibilities on completed items. Others taxed uncooked iron or gas. These taxes have been accumulated at gates or markets. The quantities had been small. Collection used to be irregular. Most smiths paid without protest. The quantities had been incorporated into the fee. Military laws also influenced weapon creation. In instances of conflict, neighborhood authorities would requisition weapons. A part of the forge's output may be claimed. The smith was once compensated. In grain or coin, these orders weren't refused. However, neither have been they regular. Conflict used to be disruptive, but not consistent. Between wars, existence resumed its percent. No single constitution managed weapon making. As an alternative, it used to be guided through overlapping methods, guilds, councils, customs, expectations, all of which moved slowly and interacted gently. Law used to be no longer strict. It used to be persistent. It did not push. It formed. It allowed the craft to continue inside boundaries understood via all. In the subsequent section, we will be able to gently discover the rhythms of the medieval craftsman's day, when he rose, when he labored, how he rested, and the way his days adopted seasons as an alternative than ours. But for now, the files are quiet, the guilds adjourned, the inspectors gone, and the forge returns to its usual tasks, unchanged and uninterrupted. In the long arc of the medieval year, the life of the craftsman, including people who made weapons, was guided not by using the hourglass or the mechanical clock, but by slower, older indicators, the rising and environment of the sun, the tolling of bells from the parish church, the climate of the season, the sounds of the village square. These formed the sample of on a daily basis, and every day used to be, in its broadest outline, very like the one before it. The craftsman's morning began not with haste, but with addiction. Mild entered the window, in general unglazed, repeatedly shuttered. If the season was summer season, the dawn arrived early, and work might with the daybreak. In winter, the hearth was kindled before the sky brightened. There used to be no alarm. The rhythms of waking followed the rhythms of the house. A household stirred, and with it, so did the work. Before any device was lifted, the forge needed to be made ready. Ashes from the previous day had been cleared. A brand new fireplace used to be laid with kindling and charcoal. Bellows had been inspected. Water basins had been stuffed. Tongs and hammers were organized on their wooden rests. The air smelled faintly of coal, leather-based, and iron. A piece of bread probably eaten. A drink taken from a clay vessel. Conversation, if it befell, was once temporary. Work began with simple duties. A blade to be reheated, a handle to be formed, an aspect to be checked. There was once no set order. The day unfolded in line with materials on hand, orders pending, or repairs just lately delivered. Apprentices took their locations quietly. A more youthful youngster swept the ground. The grasp examined a billet of iron. There was no loud guide. The gestures had been known. During the morning, the forge grew hotter. The bellows breathed continuously. Hammer strikes rang in delicate rhythm. The work was not fast. Heating took time. Cooling took longer. Duties moved forward slowly. The percent was determined by the hearth, with the aid of the metal, and with the aid of the climate. On cold days, hands had been warmed at the coals. On hot days, water was poured throughout the threshold to keep dust down. A cloth blanketed the top. The hearth endured, unchanged. Midday arrived without clock or chime. Hunger, greater than anything, signaled the pause. Tools were laid down. The fire was allowed to die fairly. Bread and cheese had been eaten. If the loved ones included a garden, might be onion or cabbage as good. There was once no set size for the meal. It ended when rest had been adequate. In summer, it used to be temporary. In winter, longer. The afternoon again with quieter labor. The warmness of the forge had passed its peak. Edges were filed. Handles had been outfitted. Small repairs have been accomplished. A tourist could arrive, carrying an historical blade to be hardened. A cart might discontinue, providing a sack of charcoal or a size of ash wooden. These movements have been met with calm acknowledgement. They did not interrupt the drift. They became part of it, because the sun reduced, work slowed. No bell rang to mark the top of the day. Shadows lengthened. The forge dimmed. The hearth used to be let go. Tools had been lowered back to their hooks or cabinets. Unfinished objects were set aside with care. Ashes have been stirred, but no longer yet removed. The door used to be closed, no longer locked. The day used to be whole. Leisure adopted without enjoyment. A meal used to be eaten slowly. Some words exchanged. A prayer mumbled. A bench or straw mattress got the body. There was once little reading, little writing, little noise. The nighttime was once quiet. The leisure uninterrupted. Over the path of the 12 months, this rhythm modified simplest relatively. In summer season, workdays had been longer. In iciness, shorter. The seasons brought adjustments in gentle and warmness, not in reason. In spring, repairs were customary. After planting, Men checked their knives, their hooks, their axes. In autumn, the same before the bloodless, earlier than the quiet, tools were examined. Vacations interrupted the drift. Feast days, saints' days, and excessive holy days had been discovered. The forge used to be left bloodless. Church offerings filled the day. There was no resistance to this. The forge obeyed the calendar because it obeyed the fireplace. On such days, weapons were neither made nor repaired. Time, handed in observance, no longer in labor. The week followed the sample of the church. 6 days of work, 1 day of rest. Sunday was quiet. The forge stood still, the bellows untouched, no hammer lifted. To work on the Sabbath was no longer unlawful in each town. However, it was discouraged. Even those who were not religious rested, if handiest because others did. In instances of terrible weather, the workshop adapted. Rain made transport tricky. Dampness slowed drying. Powerful winds blew ash into corners. Snow saved customers away. In such occasions, tasks became smaller. Sorting, filing, checking, wrapping. Work was not halted, but it grew to become softer, quieter. The forge glowed much less brightly. Health problem got here and went. A cough, a fever, a sore hand. The rhythm slowed, however, didn't stop. An apprentice took on more. A mission used. To be left for the next day. The work remained. It waited. When well-being returned, so did the full rhythm. The fireplace was once stoked. The blade resumed its shape. The day returned to its ancient type. Time itself was circular. There were no points in time, no pressing deliveries, no quality rush. To finish, the blade could be capable when the blade was once equipped. The order could be stuffed when the forge had made room. The software can be repaired when the hand had healed. There used to be no obstacle. Best extend was common. And so the lifetime of the medieval craftsman, in particular the one who made weapons, proceeded with gentle constancy. On a daily basis like the one before, each and every season bringing simplest small alterations. The forge smoked. The hammer rang. The blade took form. The handle was once fitted. The bellows exhaled. The sun rose. The sun set. In the next and final section, we will be able to step again to mirror, gently, on the continuity and quiet persistence of this craft, the best way it moved forward now, not by means of invention, but by way of repetition, not via brilliance, but by means of steadiness. However, for now, the forge is dark, the floor is swept, the fireplace is low, and the craftsman has long passed to relaxation, as he continuously does, on the finish of a further common day. As we bring this long, uneventful account to its quiet conclusion, it might be helpful to remember that medieval weapon-making, though commonly related to conflict, used to be in its everyday truth, a process marked now, not through noise or urgency, however with the aid of continuity and care, from the gathering of iron in shallow earth, to the gradual shaping of blades, from the quiet fitting of handles to the unhurried wrapping of leather, each stage unfolded at a percent determined, no longer by way of ambition, but by using necessity. It was a craft of endurance, a craft of steadiness, a craft that moved ahead slowly, steadily, and without spectacle. The weapons made in the course of this time have been seldom superb. They weren't symmetrical within the today's experience. They weren't polished to a shine. They weren't solid, below strict tolerances, or subjected to standardized assessments. However, they labored. They served their motive. They usually lasted. After they failed, they had been fixed. When they dulled, they had been sharpened. When they broke, they had been refit. And so the cycle persisted. The craftsman who made these objects did not remember himself. He potted. He was once part of his town, his village, his loved ones. He worked in view that work was wanted. He discovered considering that someone had taught him. He handed his competencies on the grounds that anyone requested. There were no patents, no treatises, no inventions bearing his name. Simplest quiet expertise, shared handy, voice to ear, eye to action. Taught instruments have been passed down. The hammer used by the grasp had been used by the master's grasp. The bellows, patched and releathered, had breathed into many fires. The anvil, worn delicate, bore the marks of blades lengthy in view that long gone. Nothing was once discarded. Calmly, even a broken file, possibly reshaped into a small chisel. Even a failed blade could become a hook. Waste was once now not usual. Renewal was once the norm. The setting, too, remained steady. a low-roofed workshop, a simple bench, a clay fireside, the identical stones on the floor, the same soot on the beams by way of the open door, the equal route to the good, the equal tree outside the window. Time passed. However, the space did not alternate speedily. A new software could arrive. An extra apprentice might sweep the ground. But the shape of the work endured. There were interruptions. A levee known as a hearth, a poor harvest, sickness, flood, drought. These altered the rhythm, but they did not end it. When the disruption ended, the forge was once lit once more. The iron was reheated. The hammer was lifted. The assignment resumed. The work remembered itself. Buyers got here and went. A lord steward inquiring for replacements. A farmer needing repairs. A service provider offering exchange. The faces modified. The voices, the garb, the coin. However, the wishes remained acquainted. A cutting edge, a strong manage, a decent grip. The form would vary. However, the motive didn't. Over decades, over centuries, the operate held steady. And so the craft persevered. It unfolds slowly from place to situation, now not as innovation, but as movements, from father to son, from master to apprentice, from town to village and back again. The equal system, repeated with small changes. The identical advantage, reshaped. In small methods, the same work, continued by means of new fingers. This persistence didn't attract attention. It was once no longer recorded in chronicles. It used to be not the field of poems. It used to be now not illustrated in vivid colors. Nevertheless, it used to be gift. Below the more seen movements of history, behind each and every weapon utilized in battle, behind each and every tool in a soldier's package, there was once the unseen work of a man or woman who heated, struck, formed, and fitted not for glory, but on the grounds that that was the challenge. There may be remedy in such continuity, within the suggestion that a factor good executed needn't alternate to stay just right, that slow work can nonetheless be true work, that quiet labor can nonetheless go away lasting traces. The weapon maker of the Middle Ages did not search permanence. However, permanence, in a technique, observed him, now not by means of monuments, however by means of repetition, through the act of doing the same venture good, over and over again, for reasons that required no explanation. And now, as we shut, we return to the quiet forge. The fireplace is out. The tools are hung. The walls are nonetheless. The blades leisure. In rows, the air is cool. The work, for today, is finished. But the work itself continues in other places, in other hands, formed with the aid of the equal forces, guided via the identical rhythms. In this long and consistent lifestyle, nothing used to be hurried, nothing used to be wasted, nothing used to be forgotten. Best persisted, slowly, quietly, because it consistently had been.